Juliane Koepcke was sitting comfortably next to her mother on board Lancer Flight 508 from Lima to Pucallpa in Peru. The next, she was hurtling through the air. When she finally came to a stop on the ground, she was miraculously still alive, but her nightmare was just beginning. Juliane was born in Lima, Peru, to two German zoologists, Maria and Hans Wilhelm Koepcke, who both worked at Lima's Museum of Natural History. Her life was anything but ordinary. Her parents first moved to Peru to study wildlife, but they also became deeply involved in conservation, lobbying to protect the jungle from clear-cutting, hunting, and colonization. And Juliane was along for the ride. When she was 14, they left Lima to establish the Panguana Research Station deep in the Amazon rainforest. And once again, young Juliane was right there with them. While most teenage girls are making friends or chasing crushes, Juliane was with her parents in the depths of the Amazon, learning how to survive in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. She later spoke of these early days in the jungle. "I grew up knowing that nothing is really safe, not even the solid ground I walked on. Knowing this would soon become the difference between life and death." Juliane's zoologist parents gave their daughter an education unlike any other, but educational authorities didn't exactly consider it the equivalent of a degree. When she was 17, she had to return to Lima to take her exams. She graduated on December 23, 1971. Her mother had wanted to leave earlier, but Juliane begged to stay just one more night. The teenage Juliane already spent enough time alone in the jungle, so she begged her mom to let her stay for the dance. Because of that, their flight home was booked for the following day, Christmas Eve, 1971. The chance of Flight 508 was the very last available flight to Panguana aboard a Lockheed L-188 Electra. Juliane's father knew of this particular plane well, for the worst reasons. Out of the 170 Electras that were built, 58 of them either crashed or suffered extreme malfunctions. When her father heard what plane they were booked on, he urged them not to take it. Juliane and her mother didn't want to miss Christmas, so they disregarded her father's advice and booked the flight anyway. There were bad signs immediately. To their frustration, the flight on December 24th ended up being 7 hours late. The passengers and crew were frustrated and exhausted by the time they got on board. The flight was only scheduled to last an hour. Near the back, Juliane took the window seat while her mother sat in the aisle. They ate sandwiches, and 45 minutes went by without incident. 15 minutes before reaching their destination, the sky suddenly went pitch black. Lightning started to flash all around the plane, and chaos broke out in the cabin. Turbulence struck the cabin hard. Baggage started falling from overhead. Drinks and food flew everywhere, and the passengers started screaming. Suddenly, a flash of lightning brighter than any of the rest exploded over the plane's wing. It was a direct hit. As soon as the lightning struck, the plane lurched into a nosedive. Juliane's mother whispered, "That is the end. It's all over." Then suddenly Juliane was airborne. The plane immediately started breaking apart when the lightning hit, and as it did, Juliane and her entire seat were suddenly thrown out of the plane and into the air. Remembering that moment, she said, "The next thing I knew, I was no longer inside the cabin. I was outside in the open air. I hadn't left the plane. The plane had left me." Juliane was properly buckled up when the lightning hit, but it's hard to say whether that was what saved her. It did mean that she was still buckled into her seat as she plummeted 10,000 feet through the air. She had only an instant to even realize what had happened and look down at the canopy far below before she blacked out from the fall. Against all odds, Juliane regained consciousness on the forest floor. She was either the luckiest person in the world or the unluckiest. She simply lay there on the forest floor, strapped to her seat and unmoving for a full day, night, and into the next morning. As she lay there, she assessed her situation. Juliane had spent countless hours in the jungles around Panguana. As she lay there, She quickly recognized the sounds of familiar frogs, birds, and insects. That meant she wasn't far from home. Juliane couldn't see out of one eye, had a broken collarbone and some deep gashes. But for a 10,000-foot fall, she was in remarkably good shape, and she was going to need every ounce of strength she had left. The dense forest canopy managed to slow Juliane down just enough to prevent her from suffering a fatal injury, though the branches left plenty of painful wounds along the way. It's also possible that remaining strapped to her seat helped slow her fall through the branches. Finally, the following morning, Juliane managed to free herself from her seat and get up. She had survived a plane crash, but that was just a fraction of her trial. The many dress and sandals that the 17-year-old Juliane had put on for her flight were not ideal survival gear. She spent the days in extreme heat and pouring rain, then got extremely cold at night with only the flimsy dress for warmth. The crash occurred during the rainy season, probably the worst time to be stranded in the jungle. None of the trees bore fruit, and it rained relentlessly, making a fire impossible. She lost one of her shoes and her glasses in the crash, which meant she was fumbling through the jungle half-blind. The snakes were one of the many things that she learned about from her parents. She was very aware that without her glasses, a camouflaged snake would be almost invisible until it was too late. The best thing you can do when you're lost in the jungle is to find moving water and then follow it downstream. And that's exactly what Juliane did. 4 days into her trek downstream, she heard a new sound, and this one sent a chill down her spine. It was the heavy wing beats of a king vulture. Juliane immediately realized what that meant. King vultures spend most of their time soaring over the rainforest, only landing when there's a lot of carrion around. Juliane knew they were there for the bodies from the crash, and they were closer than she realized. Following the creek, Juliane turned a corner and saw 3 passengers from her flight, together on a bench, rammed head first into the ground, their legs sticking up into the air like fence posts. The 17-year-old had never seen a dead body before, and she stood there completely paralyzed with panic, alone in the middle of the jungle. Then she had a terrible thought. She thought that one of the bodies might have been her mother. She poked it with a stick before seeing toenail polish and realized it couldn't be her. Juliane did find a bag of candy among the wreckage, the first food she'd found since the crash. As her torment continued, Juliane could hear rescue planes scanning overhead, but none of those planes were ever going to find her. She couldn't have known that the largest search in Peru's history was happening overhead, but the forest canopy was so dense, the rescue operation couldn't even locate the crash site, let alone a single survivor. As the days wore on, the sounds of planes and helicopters overhead went silent. If Juliane held out any hope for rescue, it was gone. The only person who could save her was herself. The journey through the rainforest would be brutal for someone in perfect health, and Juliane was still terribly injured. To make the going easier, she swam in the stream for much of the trek, but that came with its own dangers. The rivers of the Amazon contained piranhas, and Juliane was covered in wounds. Her father had taught her that piranhas are only dangerous in the shallows, so she floated in the middle of the river as she worked her way downstream. The days kept passing with no end in sight. By the 9th day, Juliane was horribly sunburned, near starvation, and could barely walk. The best she could manage was to drift down the river, piranhas or no piranhas. One of the most nightmarish parts of Juliane's ordeal was the wound on her right shoulder, which had grown infected with maggots, but fly larvae to be more specific. But just as hope was fading, Juliane found her salvation. Looking around a bend in the stream, she saw her first sign of civilization in 9 days, a boat. At first, she didn't think it was real. She says touching it and feeling that it was real hit her like an adrenaline shot. She followed a nearby path and found even more good news: shelter. The path led to a simple hut with a roof made of palm leaves. To Juliane, it must have looked like the 4 seasons. The shelter didn't have food or clothing, but it had a can of gasoline, and it gave Juliane an idea. But it wasn't going to be pretty. Though they sound like they're from a horror movie, butterfly larvae infestations aren't that rare in the jungle. Juliane's dog had gotten an infection once, and she'd seen her father treat it with kerosene. Juliane poured gasoline all over her shoulder, but things got worse before they got better. The maggots started burrowing deeper into her skin to try and escape the noxious liquid. In intense pain, and after all she'd already been through, Juliane started pulling maggots out of her wound. She believes she pulled 30 of them before she was done. The maggot purge was all she had energy for, and Juliane passed out under the shelter. When she regained consciousness, she heard voices for the first time since crashing down to earth. The voices she heard were the 3 Peruvian loggers who used the hut. She thought they might as well have been angels, but they thought she was a demon. When the loggers laid eyes on the pale, shivering wreath in their hut, they thought they were looking at a water spirit, and water spirits could be dangerous. Though the workers were afraid at first, Juliane managed to croak out a greeting in Spanish and explain her situation. She was finally saved. First, the loggers brought her by canoe to a local village. From there, she was airlifted to a hospital to treat her wounds. After reaching the hospital, Juliane was finally reunited with her father, who had spent the last 10 days praying for any news of his wife and daughter. Authorities later determined that Juliane wasn't the only person to survive the crash. They estimate that around 14 others likely survived the fall. Whether due to their wounds from the crash or the danger of the jungle, none of the other survivors of the crash made it out of the Amazon alive. Juliane later learned that her mother was one of the other passengers who survived the initial crash. However, she was badly injured and unable to move. While Juliane was working her way downstream, her mother was trapped where she landed, until she eventually succumbed to exposure after a few days waiting for rescue. There was an investigation into the crash almost as soon as it occurred. Peruvian authorities wanted to know if the tragedy had been preventable, and it didn't take long to come to an answer. The report found that the infamously shady airline intentionally sent the plane into hazardous weather conditions due to pressure to keep up with the busy Christmas schedule. Lanza was already on its last legs. The plane that crashed was their last functioning airliner, all others either being phased out or crashing. The Peruvian government revoked the company's license 2 weeks after the crash. After what she'd been through, most people would never go back to the jungle again. But Juliane quickly returned to assist rescue crews in locating the crash site and recovering the bodies of the victims. She eventually became a zoologist, just like her parents, specializing in bats. When her father passed away in 2000, she took over Panguana, the research station they'd founded in the Peruvian jungle, when she was a teenager. In 1971, film director Werner Herzog was in Peru, scouting locations for his film Aguirre, The Wrath of God. He was supposed to be on board Lanza Flight 508 before a last-minute schedule change saved his life. In 1998, Juliane and Herzog teamed up for a walk down memory lane. The two of them took the same flight path as Flight 508, then visited the scene of the crash before following Juliane's path out of the jungle. Even all those years later, Juliane and Herzog uncovered pieces of Flight 508 all over the jungle, from metal wreckage to entire rows of seats. Retracing the steps of her experience helped Juliane find closure, though as she said in the film, one question will always haunt her. Why did she survive while everyone else perished? Bye!